Okay, let's get started. Welcome back, everyone, or welcome if you didn't join the first session. Erik and I are really excited to have you here for this pre-conference on visual politics. I'm Cristian Vaccari from Loughborough University. I'm a professor of political communication. I'm going to chair the first session. Just a very quick housekeeping for those of you who are not in the morning session. Morning in the UK, of course. Everyone's microphones will be on mute apart from the presenters. The best way to interact with each other and with the presenters is to use the chat. So, for those who are not familiar with Zoom, if you go to the bottom of your Zoom interface, there's a button that says chat. I would suggest you click on it, and that will bring the chat next to your video feed. And that way you can see the video feed and the chat at the same time and interact with all of us. Presenters will have 20 minutes. That includes their presentation and the Q&A session. So we've encouraged presenters to talk for about 10, 12 minutes. And then we'll have, if they do that, we'll have, about 8 minutes for Q&A. Those who talk for longer will have shorter Q&A sessions. And every presentation plus Q&A will not last longer than 20 minutes so that we can move things forward in time and let everybody the right amount of time to present. I think that's it for now. If somebody is not comfortable with people tweeting about their presentation, please let us know. If you're going to tweet, it would be great if you could use the hashtag ICA visual politics so that we can see all the tweets in the same place. We are recording this session and we will make it available as soon as we practically can. And that will also include the transcript of the chat next to the video.
Cristian, let me interject one point on the chat. It's a really interesting feature. You can ask questions at any time and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. But if there's not enough time to answer all the questions, go ahead and write them down anyway. And the presenter can answer people after their session. And so we've had some really good conversations that way. So I would encourage you, however short, however long, however many questions you have, go ahead and put them in that chat box. And presenters, we found they really like to answer them. So go ahead and do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And during the Q&A, the chairs of the session will read some of the messages in the chat. So that's how you can ask a question directly in a live, format. But as Erik said, a lot of interactions are going to happen just in the chat, and that's great. Okay, so let's start with our first speaker, Alison Stieven-Taylor from Monash University, who is going to present a paper titled Everyday Climate Change and 3 US Daily Newspapers Comparing the Visual Representation of Climate Change. Alison, over to you.
Thanks, Cristian. So I've recorded my presentation, so I'm going to play that for you now. Hello, my name is Alison Stieven-Taylor, and I lecture in the School of Media, Film and Journalism at Monash University in Australia. I'm also a freelance journalist and have worked as a communications consultant for the past 20 years. I'm going to share some insights from my PhD research into the ways in which visual journalists concerned with social change are using the digital media space and the photo app Instagram specifically. And the geographic focus for my study is the United States. My paper compares the visual representation of climate change in 3 US newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times, with the Instagram feed, Everyday Climate Change, during the 2015 Paris Climate Conference, or COP21. And the timeframe I'm looking at is from 29 November to 8 December 2015. These newspapers, also known as the Prestige Press, continue to play a crucial role in directing public and policy response to climate change. On this slide are pictures from the sample. These are pictures from the Prestige mastheads, and these are pictures from Everyday Climate Change. So the time frame for analysis is determined by the period when everyday climate change posts focused on COP21 through the use of hashtags. COP21 has been the subject of scholarly research with an emphasis on word journalism, but the event provides a rich seam of visual material through which to undertake a comparative analysis. Everyday Climate Change is an Instagram feed that was established in 2015 by freelance visual journalists. Everyday Climate Change is part of the Everyday Projects, an initiative by two journalists, Austin Merrill, a former editor of Vanity Fair, and Peter DeCampo, a visual journalist based in Africa. Using evidence-based photography, Everyday Climate Change is designed to convey that human-induced climate change is not something that is happening over there, but is something that affects the whole planet, as founder James Whitlow Delano states. Everyday Climate Change began with 20 visual journalists from 5 continents. In 2019, there were more than 50 contributing visual journalists from 6 continents, and the feed has a following of upwards of 140,000. It is only in the past 2 decades that scholars have begun to seriously consider the representation of climate change through photographs, moving image, and graphics. In 2010, Saffron O'Neill conducted one of the first studies in the US media's use of photographs to convey climate change. There have been similar investigations into the British, Canadian, Australian, and European press. Both textual and visual studies confirm the media as an important site for information about climate change. There is a recognised deficit in scholarly research on climate change and the influence of social media platforms, and Instagram in particular, which is increasingly becoming a source of news. My key research question asks if Instagram, as a microblogging platform, provides freelance visual journalists with an alternative publishing space through which to challenge the press's hegemony over the visualisation of climate change. Why have I chosen to examine Instagram? Social media may be used as a generic term to define social networks, but each platform has its own culture. Instagram, as a microblogging platform, provides visual journalists with the opportunity to publish a broader range of narratives that may not address the prevailing news agenda. Just as environmental groups have used digital communications technology to bypass the media, Everyday Climate Change provides visual journalists with an alternative publishing channel. Communication theorists Couldry and Curran suggest that alternative media is defined as media production that challenges, at least implicitly, actual concentrations of media power. Aiton and Hamilton echo this idea, arguing that practitioners of alternative journalism use new communication forums as a means of contesting the imbalance of media power in mainstream media. Despite being owned by Facebook, Instagram provides a space where alternative kinds of media discourses exist. In this environment, Everyday Climate Change can be considered a specific community of interest, where people concerned with a particular social issue congregate. Through the opportunity for users to share posts by tagging others, the feed can also reach new audiences, expanding the scope of activity and engagement. Research indicates that the public tends to defer to popular media to make sense of climate-related issues. With millions of users worldwide, Instagram is undoubtedly a form of popular media. While consumption does not necessarily translate to influence or action, Everyday Climate Change does provide its audience with the resources and opportunity for direct participation. This is facilitated through the capacity to like, share, comment on posts, and interact with the photographer and other members of the community. My research draws on 2 interrelated theories of representation: Stuart Hall's constructionist view of representation as an essential part of meaning-making in a society. In particular, my interest is in the way the media construct meaning around climate change and how this influences the public's understanding of and response to the issue. I also draw on Boykoff, Goodman and Curtis's work on the cultural politics of climate change. The press's approach to visualising the climate crisis helps to shape the cultural politics of climate change through the privileging of certain narratives at the expense of others, creating a constructed and limited view of the problem. While it is naive to think the press can cover every angle of the climate crisis story, press coverage is said to be strongly event-driven and episodic, which narrows the public's frame of reference. This event-driven approach is evidenced in the spike in media attention to climate change when there are important political events such as COP21, or when there are significant weather events such as heatwaves, superstorms and bushfires, stories that can be told through dramatic narratives. Notably, audience research indicates that very few Americans associate global warming with extreme weather events, and this is despite images of nature being used regularly in the news media. The reliance on drama acts to elevate climate change to celebrity status. As a consequence, climate change reportage is subject to the short-lived issue attention cycles that are associated with celebrity. Not all stories about the climate crisis can be portrayed through dramatic narratives. Important stories may not meet selection criteria in a media environment that must accommodate competing news stories. In this study, I've used content analysis and framing analysis. Content analysis was useful in identifying the number of articles and the types of images the sample newspapers published in comparison to everyday climate change. In this survey, only online articles were considered. The adoption of framing analysis allowed the identification of the constructed meaning of the images. As Bullock et al. Acknowledge, framing affects more than how a story is told. It also influences how social problems are perceived. Nisbet notes that in conveying climate change, framing and storytelling play an integral foundational role. As such, framing is a key aspect of media representation through which temporal, engaging and culturally specific narratives are used to further knowledge of the problem. The framing analysis of the photographs from the newspaper sample considered the search keywords, the article headline, the photograph's caption, as well as the content of the photograph itself, all of which inform understanding of the narrative frame and context. Article content was not analysed. Everyday climate change posts were analysed by considering the photograph itself, the caption and the accompanying hashtags. The analysis also considered the geographic location of photographs to assess the breadth of coverage. In my analysis, I've considered the 5 general media frames as defined by Dirks and Gelder. The sample documents met the criteria for 3 of the 5 frames and were sorted accordingly into responsibility, conflict and consequences. Images were subsequently categorised into the dominant narrative themes within these frames: politics, economics, renewables, science, and personal stories. These themes were defined by either section headings of the newspapers or through interpretation of the article's headline, photographic content, and captioning. A final tier of categorisation, the photographic style, was then applied to the sample. These photographic style categories were chosen from research on the media's visualisation of climate change, which reveals the media draws on well-trodden frames of reference to depict climate change, including nature, negative and positive images of industry, and portraits of celebrities and political leaders. There are several key insights I'd like to share. The first is that my research reveals the press uses photographs to reinforce certain political viewpoints. During COP21, images of cities shrouded in thick smog were common in narratives associated with China. During the survey period, both the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times published images of smog in Beijing. At the time, Los Angeles was ranked 7th worst in the US for unhealthy air particles and the worst for ozone pollution. The Los Angeles Times distancing of the problem is considered to contribute to the public's inability to understand the climate crisis in terms of personal accountability. It is also reflective of the cultural politics of climate change, where certain narratives are elevated to promote domestic political ideologies. Secondly, it is evident the press relies heavily on political portraits. My findings align with research that shows the pairing of these images with climate change narratives positions the issue as an elite problem and can lead audiences to feel disempowered, believing solutions are out of their reach. Additionally, politicising climate change may polarise audiences, which also impacts action. While everyday climate change photographs were connected to COP21 via hashtags, of the 27 posts on the feed, only 1 featured a politician. This gives credence to the idea that alternative spaces like Instagram do not mirror the media and can provide different perspectives to the dominant narrative. Additionally, the press obfuscates through the lack of text-image cohesion. Of the 34 stories in the Washington Post, 29% lacked image-text cohesion. In the New York Times, it was 16% of 54, and the Los Angeles Times, 18% of 38. This is an example of the lack of relationship between the picture and the headline, which also reflects the cultural politics of climate change. Compare the headline to the photograph and its caption. Despite the headline referring to the climate talks, the focus of the photograph and its caption is terrorism. Another finding is that the press uses old images. This article is illustrated with a photograph of the cooling towers of a brown coal power station in Germany. Not only is this photograph unrelated to the headline, it is also 6 years old, which again acts to distance the problem. In contrast, posts on everyday climate change make explicit the relationship between the image and text. This is important because a lack of cohesion in visual and textual narratives can result in a constructed representation of the issue that may act to distance the problem and disaffect the audience. One of the most significant findings was the divergence in photographic frames between everyday climate change and the three newspapers in relation to the consequences of climate change and its implication for humans. Under the consequences frame, everyday climate change places greater emphasis on personal stories than the press, as this graph shows. Everyday climate change's emphasis on the human dimension of climate change is in contrast to the press's focus on politics, economics, renewables, and science. In the same way that images of people are important means of localising climate change, they also aid in humanising the issue in a global context. The final finding I'd like to share is about geographic breadth. One of the stated objectives of everyday climate change is to communicate that climate change is happening everywhere, and therefore analysis also considered the geographic location of the sample group. As this graph indicates, the geographic reach of everyday climate change shows the global impact of climate change, and in particular those regions impacted the most, such as Africa, Asia, and the island nations. In comparison, Europe dominates the coverage in the New York Times and the Washington Post in particular. There is, as Nisbet reminds us, also little attention given to climate change as a consequence of US domestic policy by the press, and this is considered one of its failings. In conclusion, everyday climate change challenges the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times' hegemony over the visualisation of climate change in two ways. Firstly, this Instagram feed presents greater diversity in narratives, thematic and geographic. This contests the press's limited visual representation of the issue and the cultural politics of climate change that elevates certain narratives in the news agenda at the exclusion of others. Everyday climate change provides a more expansive view of this global issue, as this analysis demonstrates, although the posts are not without their own preoccupations and agendas. Secondly, the explicit nature of everyday climate change posts, where image and text work in tandem, contests the media's use of pictures as illustration, which manifests in a lack of narrative cohesion. In contrast, on everyday climate change, the photographs are the story, with words providing context. This is significant because the way images interact with text and language is essential to effectively communicating the climate crisis to the public. Instagram provides an alternative publishing space, and while there are issues with its algorithms that dictate what is popular and what appears in an individual's feed, this does not diminish the value of conversations to be had on this social media platform. This study's findings deliver important insights into the opportunity that digital networks like Instagram provide to visual journalists to act as producers and distributors of content, and to challenge the press's visual representation of social issues such as climate change.
Thank you. Thank you, Alison. Feel free to put can you unshare your screen if you haven't done that yet?
I've done that.
Okay, great. Oh, now we can see you. Yeah, great. Right, we've got a question from Olli and another one from Kirk. So Olli's asking, do you think images of climate change impacts that feature people in authentic context have the power to boost the efficacy in the audience? Or do they just serve to boost salience?
I think it's a combination of both. I think it's when we see images of people, they can be more relatable. And I think that's one of the things with everyday climate change is because the geographic breadth is so wide that we are seeing people in all different settings. And so I think that becomes a much more relatable narrative than seeing politicians making announcements.
Right. And then we got a question from Kirk who says, nice work. Your finding of a lack of text image cohesion is interesting. Do you know why the media does it, and what impacts the lack of cohesion has on the readers and the viewers?
I think in terms of why the media does it, that in many instances, photographs are still considered as illustration. They're not necessarily considered as the story. And I get a lot of feedback from the people that I've interviewed for my PhD. I interviewed visual journalists, photo editors, and also photo agents. And they all say the same thing, that often images are used still as illustration. So the photographer is still not as valued in the newsroom, despite the fact that visuals are incredibly important in conveying stories like climate change, and particularly, these dramatic narratives. And I think in terms of the lack of cohesion between text and image on the audience is that, you know, we think that there's greater visual literacy because there's so many images circulating at the moment, but I don't believe that's true. And I think that people still need words for context, and that photographs and words need to work in tandem to convey the meaning of the image.
Great. There's a question from Cassia, which is a variation of a question I wanted to ask, which is, you know, to what extent is the difference you found related to the fact that you're comparing, you know, newspapers with Instagram, with an Instagram account? And I guess the way I would phrase it is, are you planning to actually analyze the Instagram accounts of the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post? Because it might be that on their Instagram accounts, these news outlets behave a little more like everyday climate change because they need to adapt to the medium, and, you know, print newspapers might have different use of visuals than they do on Instagram.
That's a great point. And yes, I mean, that's something that I would definitely like to look at in the future. The reason that I looked at the newspaper coverage versus everyday climate change is because that Instagram account was started by visual journalists as a way for them to have a voice in the climate change narrative. And I was interested to see their images through that COP21 period versus what the mainstream media was showing.
Yeah. And finally, Ahmed says, why haven't you focused on Australian media? It would be interesting to have a comparison. I wonder if this is in
absolutely. And I guess I couldn't cover everything. So because my PhD research is US based, because I'm looking at the evolution of social reform photography, I only looked at the US papers in this instance.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Alison. That was a great start. And now I would like to invite Alina Dolea from Bournemouth University. So it's 10:22 p.m. for you as well, I suppose, Alina. Can you try and share your screen and see if everything works?
Yes.
Great. So Alina is going to talk to us about the strategic visual communication of protests, citizen diplomacy, the Romanian protests from 2017. Floor is yours, Alina. Thanks for participating.
Okay, thank you. So first I want to start by saying that this is part of a wider research grant that I'm conducting, in which I'm basically looking at the construction of country images and identities by government, which is actually, or by governments, which is actually more the traditional view, if you want, and key to the idea of public diplomacy. But I'm also looking at the construction of country images and identities beyond these strategic communication practices, more in public debates, more in elections, more around protests, a variety of public events, let's say. So basically, what I'll be talking today, or this evening, is about the protests that happened in Romania in February 2017. For a month, protesters have taken the streets in Romania, being the biggest, the widest anti-corruption and the biggest protest actually after the fall of communism. In this picture, for instance, over 500,000 people are protesting in front of the government building, anti-corruption. So that was the main aim of the protesters. What I found interesting as the protesters kept protesting, they basically gathered in the streets every day for a month, while outside there were -20, -10, -15 Celsius degrees, therefore a lot of persistence. This generated a lot of headlines worldwide. So while I was looking at these protests and their unfolding, what struck me, if you want, was how protesters started to gradually, strategically communicate to international audiences. And although projecting strategic country images is basically the desired outcome of governments through their public diplomacy practices, in this case, it's not the government, but it's actually the citizens who generate international attention and visibility for the country. So the fundamental puzzle that I'm looking at and trying to understand and to investigate is if protests can be a form of citizen diplomacy. And I'm basically looking at a stream of research around the power of images in politics and their power to generate emotions in protests. I'm also looking at the more sociological view in public diplomacy, let's say public diplomacy as a communication space or social practice. And I'm also looking at this idea that is core to the new public diplomacy. People of one country increasingly engaging with global audiences on ideas, values, and human rights. I'm also using ideas around the mediated construction of reality from Couldry and Hepp, and how this is used through deep mediatization to kind of construct imagined collectivities, and also the mediated construction and projecting of images of nations in times of social unrest. So to add to those, I'm also including or adding to those a discursive perspective, the discursive construction of national identity, or the discursive construction of country images in context beyond strategic government campaigns. So I'm basically looking at two dimensions of analysis: how the Romanian protesters are constructing self-representations, and how they are constructing certain dominant discourses about Romania. And at the same time, I'm looking at a certain mediated construction of Romanian protesters and Romania. So my research questions are around the topics used, how the Romanian protesters and Romania are characterized, the symbols used, and the discursive macro strategies and the topo used, using a corpus of data from Facebook community Corruption Kills, an exploratory corpus of articles in Romanian media and international media, as well as a collection of images, photographs, and posters in a published volume dedicated to the so-called resist protests. So some of my findings. So one of my first findings was that protesters have started to adopt gradually marketing and communication practices in order to gain visibility for their objective, which was, of course, the removal of the ordinance to scrap and pardon the corrupt politicians. I looked at how this was visually constructed, looking at the relationship between images and text. So in all the images that the protesters heavily used were, so on social media, hashtags for positioning, to create this idea of constructing a powerful movement. So we are resisting, we are seeing you, we are together, we are awakened. Discursively, the strategies used have been strategies of perpetuation. Look, our democracy is in danger, in order to mobilize and engage us, the people, versus the corrupt government, and also strategies of construction to create the unity of the protest. And this has happened also through a series of Facebook events that were mirrored with offline events, with the creation of a so-called protest of children, the one that you are seeing at the moment, but also hashtags of major cities to create this idea of unity and protests that are happening across the country, and as well a diaspora joined at some point. So there were protests, small protest movements happening in diaspora that joined this virtually, if you want. The same strategy of constructing unity was realized through these world projections, saying basically, don't be afraid. Laser projections and mobile phone lights were used to bring even more visibility to the protests. And also the construction of national identity, the flag, the Romanian flag, the national anthem, collective singing happened in prime time. So this was staged in order to be covered by national and international media. And what happened when the national anthem collective singing happened is that the movies and photos on Facebook basically hit a record of live videos. This, of course, generated a lot of interest in international media that started covering the protests. The main topics being the civic nature of the protest with the high rate of engagement among citizens, the use of social media for the organization of the protest, and the creative use of digital technologies, posters, the banners during the protests. Also, international media started with reporting on the events, but then as the protests were daily, gathering more and more people, mobilizing more and more people across the country, the strategy changed. So it became storytelling strategy, telling stories about the people behind the protests, and thus humanizing the protesters. The Romanian protesters were seen as a resource of positive visibility for Romania, and a discursive strategy was one of transformation, because Romania was a post-communist country, is a post-communist country, but basically the view is this is a country that still is undergoing transformations in a way. And now, look, we see this encouraging sign of democracy. Romanian protesters were characterized as being creative, as having power, so people power, as Financial Times label it. The New York Times even talked about protests like a Romanian or the Romanian way. And Romania was basically labeled as setting an example in Europe for how to protest and how to defend democracy. At the same time, the Romanian media started to gradually reproduce these discourses in international media with this frame. Europe saw us, international media sent its reporters to Bucharest to cover in international media what is happening in Bucharest. They legitimized the idea that protests are a form of democratization of Romanian society, and they talked about how protests grant visibility to foreign embassies in Romania and to representatives of the international community. The entire construction, if you want, was around how the West, how Europe, how others see us. And Romanian media covered extensively this positive tone and evaluation of the protest used by international media. So it was a construction of us, Romanian, versus them, the West, if you want. So Romanian protesters were the one to produce a so-called revolution of light, and Romania became a beacon of European hope, an exporter of correctness. All these headlines are basically the ones that I just talked about. Europe saw us, and Romania becomes a beacon of European hopes, how we export correctness, and so on. At the same time, protesters became more and more aware of their symbolic power and started to strategically target international audiences. They used key messages on banners in English, using play of words to kind of construct this idea of us Romanians, part of the EU, part of Europe. So it's a wider us, if you want, against them, the corrupt politicians. And they appropriated the media discourse of citizens being diplomat and acting as diplomats as representing, as promoting Romania, a Romania that is European, that is Western, that actually rocks. While Romanian protesters were considered bold, humorous, there were explicit calls of journalists on Facebook for protesters to use English on their banners so that messages can be covered by international media. There was also, these are some of the banners using the Lion King, the Liar King to target one of the corrupt politicians. And this is the Romania that rocks, that has behind the symbol of Batman. So a very recognized symbol that fights corruption, or the bad guys, generally speaking. The European, the construction of a Romania that is European is basically instrumentalized through this flash mob with EU flag created with mobile phone lights, again at a moment of prime time television news in the evening. Also, protesters are symbols of a European Romania that fights anti-corruption and defends democracy. And it's very interesting how the collective actor of protesters is constructed through experts in Marcom, journalists, civil society, opinion leaders, academic members of academic community, both in Romania and in diaspora, who actually use platforms and blogs to actually explain, tell to the Western eye, if you want. And they even use this, some of them even use this phrase, all eyes in Romania, on Romania, and it's actually on this picture. So concluding, the international visibility attracted by protesters and the positive association with the country eventually turned the protests into a form of citizen diplomacy as part of this new public diplomacy where people communicate, engage with people of other countries. But this is an indirect result of a mediated, constructed process in which different actors, or to which different actors contributed, and not a strategically planned action of protesters. Put differently, the aim of protesters was not to promote the image of Romania abroad or to articulate, to support the foreign policy goals. On the contrary, the protesters were actually contesting the government, asking for its resignation. But nevertheless, the affirmation of anti-corruption and democratic principles that are universal, despite the very cold winter days, the use of creativity, humor, gained this international benevolence. And especially, it was that all that was very appealing because we're talking about post-Brexit context in the EU, in Europe, the rise of urban right-wing policies and populism in Hungary, Trump's election. So all this idea around hope and around setting an example, it was strategically instrumentalized by protesters at a particular and strategic moment in time. So protesters ultimately used this strategically to amplify the symbolic power of the Romanian protests and creating these alternative discourses about Romania as a creative country, country of people who fight corruption and ultimately bring hope from Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina. We have a couple of questions from the chat box. And again, welcome to those who have just joined us. And please feel free to comment and ask questions using the chat box on Zoom. So the first question is from Roland. And he's asking whether did you find that visual representations of protests in Romania are, have unique features of either a cultural or topic specific nature? Or do they display similarities with iconic representations of other protests around the world?
I would say that it seems to be quite similar with what is happening elsewhere, but yet I haven't carried out an analysis, a comparative analysis to argue for that. What I found really interesting, and I think if this is the Romanian context, and it would be interesting to see if other post-communist countries that are undergoing protests are experiencing similar things. So what is interesting is this obsession of Romanians for how others perceive us, how we are seen by the Western eye, so to speak. So there was always this idea, and that's why Romanian media, or in Romanian media, this is a recurrent topic, how we are perceived by others, how we are seen. Romania has a bad image. This is in itself a public issue recurrent on the public agenda in Romania. So this would be the particularity, maybe, of the Romanian case.
Thanks. I see there are lots of questions that are popping up, and I think you can definitely continue engaging with them as we move on. But just briefly, one from Cesar: were there some explicit clashes between the image of the nation as proposed by the authorities and that proposed by protesters?
Yes, in a way. I mean, the Romanian government has actually instrumentalized a lot of ideas around national unity. They construct national unity different. So the protesters appealed to the European values and these universal values, if you want, fighting what is wrong, fighting corruption and so on, appealing to democratic values, while the government had a more nationalist type of narrative to boost this image of Romania, if you want. So here would be the clash, but yeah, I can talk more about it using the time.
Okay, thank you very much, Alina. And we now moved to Ahmed Al-Rawi from Simon Fraser University, who is going to talk to us about Kek's memes war on Instagram.
Thank you again for the opportunity to present at the ICA pre-conference. So today's presentation is on memes war on Instagram, but of course Twitter is included, though the focus mostly is on Instagram. Okay, so I just want to give context to this topic, and I started learning about the online community, which is called Kek or Kekistan, after studying fake news on Instagram. And I just stumbled upon this term. I was completely unfamiliar with it. So I started digging and researching it, and I found it to be really interesting. It seems to be an alt-right group that is somehow active on different platforms. And I found it to be very, very active on Instagram in particular, as well as on other video game platforms. So what's the context? The etymology, the origin of the word comes from Kek, which is the old Egyptian god of chaos, which could either be female or male. And they added the addition, which is Istan, to denote it's a country. And that's the whole idea. That's the whole argument that they make. And of course, there are different interpretations why they use Istan. Some people, scholars, would claim that it resembles the ending of many Muslim countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on. And they are just trying to mimic or make fun of these like names. In all cases, this community is connected to the conspiracy theorist community, which is called QAnon. It's well known to be supportive of the US President Donald Trump, especially in their own belief that there is a deep state or conspirators who are trying to depose Donald Trump and take power from him. So they have a flag, which is this one on the top, the green flag. And if you notice, it's very close to the Nazi flag. So they are, again, making some adjustments, but definitely they still they're very much connected to the alt-right and, of course, the white supremacist groups here. Even the color green is supposed to be also borrowed from the color of Islam. So there is some kind of, again, mimicking of different Muslim majority countries here. Again, it's all about mocking them with the use of these mimetic images. Now, one of the main features of this community is that it uses coded messages. So if you want to study them, you need to be very familiar with the kind of language they use. It's all very much coded. So this is one meme that they have where they use a lot of language from the semiotics, like, you know, the research method that we have. But this is highlighted in yellow. It says the picture will be the signifier. The signifier will be will force the Q, and the Q will be answered with this hashtag. I'll explain this hashtag in a minute. But notice here, the majority of what they are talking about is very much coded. And that's part of the nature of this online community, because they are trying to emphasize their tightly knit community members, and that it's really difficult to be part of it unless you know their own language. So just to give you one example from what you see here in front of you, notice here the three brackets and the plus sign it's here and here as well. These three brackets are supposed to be a reference to Jews. So they are using it in order not to say Jews directly, again, in order not to be deleted or banned from the platform. Okay, so this is one of the most important hashtags they use, the WWG1WGA, which means where we go one, we go all. Which is a line taken from the 1996 Jeff Bridges sailing adventure or movie. The thing about this hashtag is that it shows them some kind of solidarity among the community members. So wherever we go together. We are one and in like a strong unit. So they have also other terms, or let's say coded languages, like for instance, white hat is a reference to a Trump supporter. Black hat is in league with the deep state, again, conspiring against Donald Trump, like people supporting Hillary Clinton. Breadcrumbs is again, a secure post known to be the faithful, and the people who try to figure out the language of the Kikistanis are called bakers. So this is interesting, the other hashtag they use, which is red pill, blue pill. Why interesting? Because 2 days ago, Elon Musk, actually, the famous Tesla CEO and the guy who's supposed to take us to Mars, he tweeted the hashtag red pill, and then it was retweeted by Ivanka Trump. In fact, the red pill hashtag is one of the most popular ones used by the Pakistani community, the white supremacist community. So it's very, for me, it's really shocking that someone well-known like Elon Musk uses it. So what is a red pill? It's taken from, as you know, the Matrix movie, the science fiction movie, but of course it's a reference to conservative Republicans. And they use it in contrast to the blue pill, which is a reference to the liberals and Democrats. So, and here when they talk about liberals, they are usually referred to as libtards, which is liberal retards. And also they talk about red wave taking over the blue wave. So it's all very much coded language that they use in this community. Most importantly, they use memes. And that's the whole argument I'm trying to make here. So memes are supposed to be funny, but for them, they've weaponized it. And they focus also on certain platforms such as Instagram, because in my view, they also weaponize this platform. So it's supposed to be humorous. They add a lot of funny things, funny images, but there is a lot of embedded serious messages going on. So for them, they call themselves activist warriors as well, because they are involved in a cultural war whose purpose is to keep Donald Trump in power. And have a look at this meme. They say the world will know that free men stood against a tyrant, that few stood against many, and before this battle is over, then that even global satanic cabal can be defeated. So for them, it's just like a battle between the forces of evil and the versus the forces of good. Of course, they represent the forces of good. So for them, this is their goal. It's a memes war, and their job, and this is what they proudly mention. So notice this is the hashtag that is one of the most recurrent one, Trump 2020. This is what they say. They say that we brought Donald Trump to power in 2016. Now the second memes war is to keep Donald Trump in power. And these are the kinds of popular hashtags that they use. So for my study, I looked at two platforms. As I mentioned before, it was mostly Twitter and Instagram. So I downloaded over 36,000 tweets referencing two words, Kyrgyzstan and kick, as well as how many Instagram? 33,000 Instagram messages using a few digital tools. And so from there, I used different digital methods to understand what this community is discussing. The first thing is just like, this is just basic. I just wanted to look at the popular hashtags used on these two platforms. So again, we see MAGA, Make America Great Again, used a lot. Trump, of course, and memes for sure. Dank memes is like, dank is a reference to something that is not that clear and funny. Also, something that usually young people really like. Okay, so after this stage, I did some kind of qualitative assessment of the, let's say, the most recurrent memes on images used by this community. And I was able to do from a qualitative assessment, I was able to identify about 5 main themes available as, in the images or memes used by this community. So I just try to present some of these themes. Number one is the anti-liberal, for sure. As I mentioned in the beginning, they are very much anti-democrat, anti-liberal in many ways. And they are not only targeting the United States, they also include Canada. This is our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. And they use a lot of memes to make fun of Justin Trudeau. Again, my idea behind this, my argument here is that these memes are supposed to be funny, so they will be able to attract younger people and maybe make them more involved in their own ideology. This is number one. The second main theme is anti-Islamic, for sure. They use a lot of memes in order to ridicule, make fun, and of course attack Muslims from different communities, especially with a focus on women. So that's the second one. The third one is a pro-community. Like the hashtag I just mentioned, where we go on, we go together. And notice here that they use some kind of military means as well. And most importantly, I forgot to mention this important symbol they use, which is Pippa the Frog, or Peep the Frog. It's a well-known now symbol that is used by this online community to to show that they are one. And it's very much, let's say, recurrent and different platforms. So just the other day, just to give you some context, the other day I was playing with my kids a video game called Roblox, and I was really shocked to see the Kyrgyzstani community very active also on Roblox. So they have, for example, Kyrgyzstani citizen #1. They have until maybe over 100. So they are active in different platforms, like the Discord as well, video game app, as well as other ones. But there is a clear militarization of the memes as well as their own symbols. There is also a clear theme of anti-LGBTQ, and then this, of course, aligns with the alt-right movement in general and the white supremacist movement in general. So this is one that they usually spread, that they borrowed from the InfoWars website, Alex Jones, and his claim that this is, of course, a conspiracy theory claim that there are gay chemicals in the water and the government is involved in it. In other words, the government is turning frogs into gays. So that's the whole, Alex Jones conspiracy theory, and it's very much, let's say, disseminated by this community. And when I looked at the most retweeted post, again, this shows you that there is a clear, let's say, pro-community message, and also highlighting the idea that the Kikistanis are persecuted and they want to assert their rights, as well as including, for example, the straight men rights. So because they feel that they have been attacked by the liberals in different ways. So in conclusion, I'm saying here that the Pakistani community relies on the affordances of social media. They have weaponized different platforms like Instagram and other ones. They are really, really active. And most importantly, they use irony and coded language in order to conceal the intended meanings of their messages, because their goal is to enhance the community, attract especially younger people to their own group, and become more active and, let's say, more influential, especially in supporting Donald Trump. And they sometimes use certain targeted hashtags as well as usernames in order to talk among each other. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. And please unshare your screen if you don't mind.
I am trying to do that.
Thank you. That's great. Let's see if there is a comment. Yes, there is a comment by Bucy, who is asking, well, this is fascinating and alarming. What are your thoughts on this slippage of the signifier dark, vague and misleading, and therefore meaning context dependent and slippery? Does this increase its ideological potential? Does it make it more dangerous? What could be done to bring such discourse to light and communicate its danger to the public so that people are alert?
Thank you very much for the question. I believe, yeah, this is an excellent point regarding the dank memes. I believe this is intentional in order to make it vague, ambiguous, and that's what they want. They want people to be a bit confused, think, and from that they become more curious, and probably they will be interested in joining or at least being engaged in the memes of this community. So that's the whole idea. So when, for example, I noticed some people are using the emoji or the hashtag or the meme of Peppa the frog without even realizing what it means. So that's, in my view, that's a great deal of danger, because they are serving this community without them realizing it, and that's one of the goals of this online community. And the other danger is that it's not online only, because there is evidence showing that they are actually becoming also visible offline. So now increasingly there are offline protests where they are carrying their own flag, the Kyrgyzstani flag, and they are protesting and talking and so on. So instead of only like looking at it as a small online subculture, I'm a bit concerned, because now they are moving away from that and like becoming more, let's say, vocal and visible.
Thank you. There's another question by Erik, who reminds us that confusion is a common goal of propaganda, and it squares with some of the research that I've recently been doing on deepfakes. And certainly textual memes and phrases and ambiguous statements play a role in this. So have you seen much activity where the use of visuals is done to promote confusion?
Yeah. I mean, notice that when I mentioned the coded language itself, honestly, like it took me so much time just to figure out a few lines and a few hashtags. It's so hard, and it requires a lot of familiarity. And this in itself is the goal, because they want you to be intrigued, confused, interested, and so on. And then you will be probably more engaged with them. That's in my view, the danger. And I believe that if you look at the research about the way Russian trolls also use the confusion element, you'll see some kind of similarity here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ahmed. Great presentation. And it's now time to hear from Olli Hellman from the University of Waikato, who is going to present a paper titled The Dictator Screenplay, Photographs of the Leader and Political Legitimization in East Asia's Communist Regimes. And that's the last presentation before a short break. The floor is yours, Olli.
Okay. Well, good morning from New Zealand. I'm on the coffee end of the spectrum, but if you want to crack open a beer or a wine, feel free to do so. I definitely did during the last session, I have to admit. So yeah, it would be hypocritical if I told you off for doing that. Okay, let's jump into the paper. So what I'm trying to do in the papers, I'm trying to find out why dictators look different. So they're visualized in different ways in propaganda. And we know a lot about why politicians in democratic regimes are visualized in different ways and how they try to create a political image for themselves through visuals. But we know very little about how dictators are visualized and what the strategic aims are behind those visualizations. So the argument I'm making is that dictators play the lead role, if you like, in legitimacy narratives. So dictatorships usually tell their citizens a narrative about why they should be in power, why it's justified to rule through non-democratic means. So what I'm arguing is that dictators, they visualize these narratives. So they're one way of telling these narratives to domestic audiences. And I make this argument through a comparison of East Asia's surviving communist regimes. So China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Laos. So these countries are not just the last remaining communist regimes in the world, with the exception of Cuba, but they're also the longest living dictatorships in the world if you exclude absolute monarchies. So I think there's a lot to be learned by looking at these regimes and how they employ visual techniques in their propaganda in order to tell these legitimacy narratives. So there's something they must be doing right. If they've been surviving for so long, there's something they must be doing right. So I think it's worth studying these regimes. Now, what's interesting about these four regimes is that they used to tell stories that were aimed at the future. So they promised people that they would be building this utopian socialist paradise. But with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, the narratives, these legitimacy narratives that regimes tell their citizens, have shifted towards the past. So now the regimes carefully cultivate a collective memory of past achievements in order to legitimize their rule. So they're not looking into the future as much as they used to, but they're looking into the past. And a lot has been studied in terms of these collective memory narratives in these remaining communist regimes, but scholars have so far focused mainly on traditional carriers of collective memory, such as museums, monuments, school books even. But the literature has not yet looked at ways in which these narratives are communicated through the mass media. So this is where my paper comes in. As I'll show you later, I'm using photographs of leaders distributed through domestic newspapers and trying to work out how these photographs are being used to tell these stories of the past. And what you have to know about these narratives is that they have a common feature, which is that they all identify foreign enemies. So foreign countries are depicted as the enemy, and the Communist Party, the respective regime party, is cast in the role of the hero who liberated the country from foreign oppression, from foreign exploitation. So that's the basic story that these four regimes tell their people. What I do as well, and I'm going to skip through this quite quickly because I don't want to get into too much detail here. I think that the visual part is probably more interesting for you guys. But what I do is I apply narrative analysis to these stories of the past, and this allows me to show that these stories differ on two dimensions. One is causality and one is emplotment. So in terms of causality, here the stories differ in terms of how they explain the behavior of those foreign aggressors who in the past had taken the country hostage. So China, Vietnam, and Laos use an intentional causality mechanism. So they argue that foreign countries, be it Western colonial powers, be it Japan, etc., they acted with intent. They saw a weak country, they saw that it was possible to exploit this weak country, and so they did. The North Korean regime, on the other hand, uses a mechanical causality mechanism. So they describe the world as this hyper-rational setting in which nobody can be trusted, not even allies can be trusted. So in fact, when China and the Soviet Union started quarreling in the 1970s, the North Korean regime adopted a ideology called Chuche, which translates as self-reliance. So they tried to become autonomous from their former allies based on this understanding that the world is hyper-rational, nobody can be trusted, not even allies, so we just have to look after ourselves. So that's the first dimension on which these stories differ. The second dimension is the dimension of emplotment. So this relates to the plot and how historical events are tied together into a story. The regimes of North Korea, Vietnam, and Laos use a monster plot, while the Chinese regime uses a rebirth plot. So the North Koreans, the Vietnamese, and Laos, they tell their people that for centuries, the people have been fighting against a foreign aggressor, or several foreign aggressors, in fact. And it was only when the regime party came to the stage and provided vital organizational and ideological guidance that this fight was won. The Chinese regime tells a slightly different story. They say that China used to be a great power, but then because of the Qing monarchy and the KMT regime that followed the Qing monarchy, and because of their self-serving behavior, because of their corruption, China weakened, and it then entered into a century of humiliation, as it's called in China, and was exploited by Western powers and the Japanese. So it was only then when the Chinese Communist Party arrives that this humiliation is finished. So they essentially want China to return to these former glorious days, overcoming the mistakes that previous regimes had made and that had led to a weakening of China. So these are the two dimensions on which these stories differ. And I argue that these reflect in photographs of the leader. So those regimes that argue that foreign powers acted with intent, they argue that what has been achieved under the regime party is an increase of international status. So these foreign powers kept the country down, they exploited it, they colonized it, and only with the arrival of the regime party has this international status been improved. So how do they communicate this through photographs? I hypothesize that they do this by visualizing the leader mainly in a setting of domestic politics and international diplomacy, because it's those photos that tell audiences, look, we've got our international status as a sovereign country back. The North Koreans, on the other hand, because they paint the world in this paranoia language, arguing that nobody can be trusted and they were surrounded by potential enemies, what they want to tell their people is that the regime provides protection against foreign threats. So again, I argue that this will then reflect in images of the leader. So the North Korean leader is more likely to be depicted in settings that relate to the production, distribution of basic necessities. So that can be food, clothing, construction work, so shelter. And as a third hypothesis, I put forward that the Korean leader is more likely to be depicted in settings of military training and operations. And then finally, the last set of hypotheses relates to China's rebirth story. So again, the Chinese Communist Party tells their people that they want to overcome the mistakes that had been made by former regimes, be it the Qing monarchy or the KMT regime. And they won't be engaging in corruption, they won't be engaging in self-serving behavior, but instead they will listen to the people. So what I argue here is that the Chinese leader is more likely to be depicted with crowds of people and with ordinary citizens. And I conducted a content analysis of over 2,000 photographs. You can see the sample details here. I have to maybe point out that in the case of Laos, I'm using two leaders because the Lao regime has a dual leadership. And I won't bore you with the measurement details, how I measure the different variables. That's all explained in the paper if you want to have a closer look. Let's look at the results, and you can see that the data moves in expected directions. So the North Korean, Vietnamese, and Lao leaders are depicted more in settings of politics and diplomacy compared to the North Korean leader, whereas the North Korean leader is depicted more regularly in settings that relate to production of basic necessities, also in military settings. And then finally, we see that the Chinese leader is depicted more regularly with crowds and ordinary citizens compared to the other three regimes. Just very briefly, I conducted sort of a simple logistic regression to show that these differences are statistically significant. So I do that for the causality dimension of the narratives, and I do this for the emplotment dimension of the narratives. But I think it's probably more interesting to have a quick look at some of the typical photographs of these leaders. So the leaders of Vietnam and Laos are depicted as what I would call party bureaucrats. So these are typical photographs that we see of them in the domestic press. They are essentially career politicians. They are depicted mainly indoors in meeting rooms or meeting other leaders. So they just perform their official duties. And again, remember that this is meant to communicate that the country has achieved its status as a sovereign nation again. And as well, I think these images communicate a sense of hierarchy. So how was sovereignty achieved? Because the party provided hierarchical guidance and leadership. So there are no common people here, there are no crowds. It's very clearly communicated that these leaders sit at the top of an hierarchical organization. We see a lot of photographs of Xi Jinping in similar settings, because the Chinese also want to communicate that they have improved China's international status. But at the same time, we see a lot of photographs of Xi interacting with crowds or interacting with ordinary citizens. And again, this serves to tell the story that the Chinese Communist Party listens to the people. They don't want to repeat the same mistakes as the Qing monarchy and the KMT regime. And then finally, we have the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, who acts like a parent. So here is a parent who provides protection. The leader specializes in many different things. He knows about agriculture. He knows about military things. So don't be afraid of this scary world around us. The leader will protect us because he's all knowledgeable. That's essentially the story that comes out of this. And interestingly, what you see when the North Korean leader visits farms or factories or schools or whatever, they're always empty. There's no people. So Kim will come with an entourage of officials, but there are no people. So this, as in the case of Vietnam and Laos, serves to highlight that it was the hierarchical organization of the Workers' Party that succeeded in liberating the country from foreign oppression. But I'll leave it here and look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Olli. Thanks very much. Let's start with a question from Roland. And yeah, please unshare your screen if you don't mind, so that we go back to the normal configuration. There should be a red button. Yeah, there you go. So Roland is asking, I was wondering why you focus on photographs only and not also on drawing and paintings, which are presumably quite frequent, at least in North Korea. Is there any difference between how different states use photographs and drawings as opposed to images? Photographs versus drawings.
That's a good question. And research has been done on this. So there's plenty of research that analyzes, for instance, propaganda paintings in North Korea. I think that the reason why I focus on photographs is that they're commonly assumed to depict reality. So people tend to think of them as more authentic than a painting. And you have all of these completely inflated, made-up paintings, for instance, in the North Korean context, where the leader visits orphanages or hugs children, and these things never happened in reality, but they serve to tell that very same story, that the leader is a parent and looks after the children, looks after society like his own children. But I think it was that supposed authenticity of photographs that really gets me interested, and how these collective memory narratives are communicated on a more subtle dimension rather than in sort of a very obvious way, for instance, by visiting an orphanage.
Right. Let's see, there is one new message from Rachel that just came in. Olli, do these images of leaders as mediators and with real people, do they contrast fruitfully with formal portraits, the kinds that hang in offices and restaurants? How does image placement and the contrast among them in their uses make up an ecosystem of leader image?
That's a good question, and I'm hoping to turn this paper into a bigger project about visual storytelling in dictatorships. So this is only a first step where I look at the mass media, but I'm hoping to turn this into a more comprehensive project where I then would be looking at sort of different settings in which images are being displayed, or even, as Roland suggested earlier, look at different type of imagery, including paintings. But that's for the future. So for the moment, I'm just focusing on photographs. But yeah, good point.
All right, we have reached 11:20, at least here in the UK, which is time for a little 10-minute break. Thank you very much, Olli, for a very enjoyable presentation, and thanks very much to all the presenters in this first block. So everyone, feel free to stretch your legs, get a drink. You don't need to log off the meeting. You can just stay on. You can mute your microphone. Well, microphone is already muted. You can mute your video if you want. And we'll reconvene in just 10 minutes with Erik Bucy's presentation.